The moment I saw my own private property sign floating down the creek like it had just given up on life, I knew this wasn't an accident, and I knew exactly who was behind it. You ever get that feeling where something small tells you a much bigger story is about to unfold? Yeah, that was me, standing there in muddy boots, watching that laminated sign spin in the current like a bad joke. My name's Caleb Mercer, and a few months ago I bought what I thought was the quietest piece of land I'd ever find just outside Asheville, North Carolina, tucked behind a stretch of woods where the trees leaned just enough to make the whole place feel like it was keeping a secret. The best part of it, the part that sold me instantly, wasn't the house or the acreage. It was the creek that cut through the back of the property, slow-moving, clear, the kind of water you could sit beside with a cheap beer and feel like you'd finally outrun the noise of the world. And here's the thing, that creek wasn't shared. It wasn't part of some neighborhood amenity. It came with full creek rights written clean into the deed, which meant from the old wooden bridge down to a crooked oak tree about 50 yards south, that water, that bank, every rock and ripple, it was mine. Now I made sure everyone knew that when I moved in, not in an aggressive way, just neighborly, casual conversations, a couple of mentions during small talk, because I've dealt with HOAs before and I know how quickly community can turn into we think we own your life. And in this neighborhood, the Cedar Ridge HOA had a reputation, not the friendly kind either, more like the kind that shows up in stories people tell with a sigh and a shake of the head. At the center of it all was a woman named Patricia Holbrook, mid-50s, always dressed like she had somewhere more important to be, oversized sunglasses, clipboard practically glued to her hand, the kind of voice that could sound sweet if you weren't listening closely, but always carried just enough edge to remind you she thought she was in charge of something bigger than she actually was. First week I moved in, she stopped by to welcome me, which mostly meant pointing out that my mailbox wasn't painted in an approved shade of black. Not kidding. There are apparently multiple shades of black that matter to these people. 2 weeks later, she left a note about my shed windows being too reflective, said it disrupted the visual harmony of the neighborhood, which is funny because my property technically sits just outside the HOA boundary, something I didn't fully understand at the time, but would become very important later. So when I saw that sign drifting in the creek, I didn't need a detective, I just followed the water upstream. And sure enough, about 30 yards up, right on my bank, I found Patricia and 2 of her regular sidekicks, a woman named Lorna and another named Beth, sitting in folding chairs like they were on vacation, fishing lines cast out into my water, a cooler open beside them, soft jazz playing from a little Bluetooth speaker like they'd set up their own private resort. I stood there for a second just taking it in, because sometimes when something's so ridiculous, your brain needs a moment to catch up, and then I cleared my throat, not loud, just enough to break whatever fantasy they were living in. Patricia turned first, slow, like she'd been expecting me but didn't care, and she gave me that smile, the kind that's all surface, no warmth, and said, "Oh, Caleb, there you are. We figured you wouldn't mind if we enjoyed the creek a little. It's such a lovely spot." I actually laughed, not because it was funny, but because it was either that or lose my temper right there, and I said, "You mean my creek, on my property, that you're currently trespassing on?" Lorna rolled her eyes like I was the one being dramatic, and Beth just took a sip from her drink like this was all perfectly normal, and Patricia waved her hand, dismissive, like she was brushing away a minor inconvenience. "Now don't be like that, Caleb. We voted at the last HOA meeting to open up the creek area for community enjoyment. It's only fair." I remember just staring at her for a second, trying to decide if she actually believed what she was saying or if this was just some power play, and I said, "You can't vote to give people access to land you don't own. That's not how property law works." She tilted her head, still smiling, but there was something sharper underneath now. "Well, we've been using it for weeks, and there haven't been any issues, so clearly it's working just fine." That word, weeks, that's what stuck with me, because if they'd been down here once, maybe you chalk it up to stupidity, but weeks means something else entirely. It means they thought they had a right to it, or worse, they thought I wouldn't do anything about it. I didn't argue any further, didn't raise my voice, didn't threaten anything. I just nodded, turned around, and walked back up toward my house, because the truth is, I had something better than an argument. I had cameras. When I first moved in, I installed 4 of them around the back lot. Nothing fancy on the surface, but wired into a private system I set up myself, motion-triggered, high-resolution, the kind of setup that doesn't miss much and doesn't lose data. I hadn't checked the creek camera in a while, not since early spring when a raccoon decided my tackle box was a buffet, but now I had a reason. By the time I got inside, I was already pulling up the footage, scrubbing back through the days, then the weeks, and what I found. Well, let's just say that moment, sitting there at my kitchen table, watching my screen, was the exact second this stopped being a neighborly dispute and turned into something a whole lot bigger. So I'm sitting there at my kitchen table, coffee going cold in my hand, scrubbing through footage that I hadn't bothered checking in weeks, and at first it's just what you'd expect. A couple deer passing through, wind moving the trees, nothing out of the ordinary, and then there they are. Not just Patricia, not just her usual crew, but different days, different people, same pattern. They weren't just visiting the creek, they were using it like it belonged to them. And then it got worse. About 3 weeks back, early morning, timestamp said 9:12 a.m., Patricia shows up with 2 guys from the HOA board. I recognized them. One was Dale Grayson, the other a guy named Mark Ellison, both part of their architectural committee, and they're not fishing, they've got a chainsaw. I remember leaning closer to the screen like that would somehow change what I was seeing, but it didn't. They walked straight to the dogwood tree near the bend, a tree that had probably been there longer than any of us, and without hesitation, they cut it down, my tree, clean through, like it was nothing. No permission, no notice, just gone. They dragged part of the trunk a few feet and set it up like a bench, laughing, taking a break like they'd just improved something. I felt that one in my chest, not even anger at first, just this heavy disbelief, like, who does that? Who thinks they can just walk onto someone else's land and start remodeling it? But it didn't stop there. 2 days later, more footage. They come back with bags of gravel, spreading it along the muddy path leading down to the creek, building a walkway. And then another clip, maybe a week after that, shows them tying a rope swing to a low branch of a sycamore, testing it like they're setting up a park attraction. And the worst part, the one that really flipped something in me. There's a clip of kids, 6 of them at least, splashing around in the water, no supervision beyond a couple adults sitting back in chairs with drinks in their hands, completely unaware, or maybe just not caring that they're on private land, that if something went wrong, if one of those kids got hurt, it would come back on me. I pushed back from the table so fast the chair scraped hard against the floor, and that's when it all snapped into place. This wasn't just trespassing anymore. This was liability. This was property damage. This was people rewriting reality because no one had stopped them yet. So I did what you do when someone crosses a line like that. You don't argue. You document, and then you escalate. I pulled still images from the footage, timestamps clear as day, printed everything out, backed up the files onto an external drive, and locked it away. Because if there's one thing I've learned, it's that when people realize they're in trouble, evidence has a funny way of disappearing, unless you make sure it doesn't. Then I made 2 calls. First one was to a friend of mine, Rachel Lawson, used to be a county prosecutor, now a real estate attorney, sharp as they come and not someone you want on the other side of a case. She picked up on the second ring, and I didn't even bother with small talk, just told her what I had, sent over a few clips, and there was a pause on the line, not long, but long enough to mean something, and then she said, "Caleb, this isn't small, this is multiple violations stacked on top of each other. You need to act now." Second call was to the sheriff's office. By mid-afternoon, Deputy Harris was standing in my backyard, watching the footage on my tablet, arms crossed, expression getting tighter with every clip. When it finished, he let out a slow breath and said, "They cut down your tree, altered the land, and invited people onto private property. Yeah, this isn't a warning situation." I asked him straight, "Can you cite them?" And he shook his head slightly. "We're past citations, you want to press charges?" There wasn't even a pause on my end. "Yeah, I do." And just like that, it shifted from annoyance to something official, something with weight. That night, Rachel called me back after reviewing everything in detail, and that's when she dropped the part one hadn't fully understood before. "I pulled your deed and the HOA documents," she said. "And Caleb, your property isn't actually under their jurisdiction." I remember sitting there in silence for a second, like I'd misheard her. "What do you mean?" She explained it clean, precise, the way lawyers do when they know what they're saying matters. "Your land borders the HOA, but it was never annexed into it. You're not a member, you're not bound by their bylaws, and any fines or enforcement actions they've tried to issue you, they don't have legal authority. I actually laughed at that, a short, disbelieving kind of laugh. So all those notes, all that nonsense, unauthorized, she said, and potentially fraudulent if they collected any money or misrepresented their authority. That's when the situation went from frustrating to almost absurd in how far they'd pushed it. Not only were they trespassing, not only were they altering my land, but they'd been acting like they had control over me when they didn't even have the legal right to be involved at all. The next morning, I filed formal complaints, criminal for trespass and vandalism, civil for damages, and Rachel started drafting an injunction to stop them from stepping foot on my property again. And here's where things started to spread, because word travels fast in neighborhoods like this, especially when it involves the HOA. 2 days later, while I was unloading groceries, my neighbor Frank wandered over, older guy, retired mechanic, always walking his husky like it was the one in charge, and he leans in a bit and goes, "Heard you got the boards served, that true?" I nodded, and he let out this low whistle. About time someone did, they've been pushing people around for years. That opened the door. Over the next couple days, more neighbors came by, not in a crowd, not all at once, but one at a time, quiet conversations, stories that sounded way too familiar, fines for things that weren't violations, threats over minor issues, pressure tactics that only worked because most people didn't want the hassle of fighting back. A young couple down the street brought over a pie, said they'd been hit with daily fines over where they parked their car, even though it matched city code perfectly. A nurse named Linda told me they'd tried to penalize her for having a small garden bed that wasn't pre-approved. And as I listened to all of it, something started to shift again, because this wasn't just about my creek anymore. This was a pattern, a system built on people assuming no one would challenge it. So I started organizing everything, not just my evidence, but theirs too, creating folders, categories, timelines, because if this was going to turn into a fight, it wasn't going to be a small one. And then the HOA made their next move, and honestly, it was the one that told me they still didn't understand what they were up against. The thing about people who've been getting away with something for a long time is they don't know how to stop, they don't pull back, they double down, and that's exactly what the HOA did. 3 days after the citations were served, I noticed a white SUV parked just off the edge of my property, engine idling, windows tinted just enough to make it obvious whoever was inside didn't want to be seen, and I stood there behind my screen door watching as the driver stepped out, took a few photos of the creek, the new sapling I'd planted where the dogwood used to be, even my mailbox, then got back in and drove off without saying a word. Now maybe to someone else that wouldn't mean much, but after everything that had already happened, it felt like a move, quiet, calculated. Rachel confirmed it the next day. The HOA had filed a request through their attorney for a property reassessment, claiming there had been unauthorized recreational modifications on my land, which was almost funny considering they were the ones who made them. It was a classic tactic: create doubt, shift attention, hope something sticks long enough to slow everything down. But what they didn't realize was that the county was already paying attention, because of the sheriff's report, because of the complaints, because the situation had moved past neighborhood drama and into something official. So when that reassessment request hit the system, it didn't land the way they expected. It triggered a review. The next morning, a county inspector showed up, clipboard in hand, calm, methodical, the kind of guy who doesn't say much but notices everything. He walked the property line with me, checked the markers, compared them to the records, and after about 20 minutes he pointed to a set of small survey flags I hadn't even noticed before and said, "You're good, everything here lines up." Then he paused, looked past my boundary toward the HOA side, and added, "But they're not." Turns out the HOA's community garden, something they'd been bragging about in their newsletters, was actually sitting about 20 feet on a county land. Not theirs, not even private, just straight-up public land they'd decided to claim. That was the beginning of the unraveling. Within a week, code enforcement got involved. Then environmental quality, because the gravel they'd spread near my creek had disrupted a protected runoff channel, something I didn't even know about, but apparently matters a whole lot when you start moving earth without permits. And here's the part that really shifted everything. I didn't file that complaint. One of the neighbors did. A retired biology teacher named Harold Benson, quiet guy, always polite, had apparently been documenting runoff issues for months, just waiting for something solid. And when he saw my footage, he had it. They've been cutting corners for years, he told me one afternoon, adjusting his hat like he was trying to keep his frustration in place. This was just the first time someone caught it clearly. From there, it didn't slow down, it sped up. The HOA's attorney withdrew from representing them after discovering they'd withheld key details. Members started turning on each other. One resigned. Another claimed they'd never supported any of it, even though their signatures were on the approvals. Then the financial records came out, and that's when it stopped being about land entirely. Turns out, Patricia and one of the board members had been approving reimbursements for equipment that didn't exist, thousands of dollars routed through a landscaping company tied to a relative, receipts that didn't match purchases, the kind of thing that looks messy until you line it all up and realize it's not messy at all. It's intentional. 2 weeks later, Patricia was arrested. No big scene, no drama, just a quiet morning, 2 deputies at her door, and suddenly the person who'd been walking around like she owned the neighborhood was being let out in handcuffs. Another board member followed not long after, charged as a co-conspirator, and just like that, the authority they'd been leaning on for years vanished. But if you think that was the end of it, it wasn't, because right when things started to settle, right when the neighborhood began to feel normal again, something else surfaced. It was a letter, certified mail, from the county tax assessor, saying my property had been flagged for an unreported structure related to recreational use, and attached to it was a blurry aerial photo of a wooden platform near the creek. The problem was, I hadn't built anything. I stared at that image longer than I probably needed to before it clicked. That wasn't my section of the creek, it was just past my boundary, on a stretch of land that, according to my deed, belonged to the county, part of a protected greenbelt. So I drove down there, followed the bend, and sure enough, there it was. A platform, maybe 10 by 12 feet, railing, posts, even a sign bolted to the front that read Community Observation Deck, Cedar Ridge HOA. And right behind it, nailed to a tree like they were doubling down on the lie, another sign warning people not to trespass on HOA property. I just stood there for a second, taking it in, because at that point it wasn't even surprising anymore. It was almost predictable. They hadn't learned, they'd just gotten quieter about it. But the part that mattered, the part that turned this from stupid into serious, was how they got it built. When Rachel pulled the permit records, we found it. The application had been filed using my parcel number. My land, my identity, essentially, used to bypass restrictions and get approval to build on land they didn't own. That's not a misunderstanding, that's fraud. The county didn't take long to act on it. Deputies showed up, statements were taken, and within days, another arrest was made. This time one of the former board members who tried to slip through the cracks after Patricia went down. During questioning, it came out that the idea had started before everything fell apart, part of a plan to expand what they claimed as HOA space, to slowly blur the lines until no one questioned where their authority actually ended. Only problem was, they got caught. Charges stacked up fast: fraud, falsification of documents, misuse of funds, and with everything already on record from the earlier case, there wasn't much room left to argue. The remaining board dissolved not long after, officially, completely, no restructuring, no rebranding, just gone. The HOA itself was disbanded, assets redistributed, oversight handed off to a neutral third party, and just like that, the system that had been running the neighborhood for years disappeared. A few weeks later, the platform was torn down by a county crew, posts pulled, ground restored, like it had never been there in the first place. I helped plant a few willows along that stretch, figured it was a better use of the space anyway. And now, when I walk down to the creek, it's quiet again, the kind of quiet I thought I was buying in the first place. No chairs, no music, no one pretending they have a right to something they don't. Just water moving, steady, doing what it's always done. But here's the thing I still think about sometimes. None of this would have happened if they'd just respected a boundary in the beginning. One line, one simple line they chose to ignore. So I'm curious, if you were in my position, would you have handled it the same way, or would you have let it slide to keep the peace? Because out here, peace comes at a cost, and sometimes the only way to get it back is to make a little noise first.